Most people think Stoicism is simple. Control your emotions. Accept reality. Focus on what you can control. When you are younger, that advice often sounds like theory, correct, but distant from real life. As you get older, those same Stoic ideas begin to make sense in a different way. They stop sounding abstract and start functioning as a practical response to limits, repetition, and the rising cost of wasted energy. After years of effort and responsibility, a different question appears. Why does a life that is mostly settled start to feel mentally exhausting? Does this sound familiar? When the same conflicts keep coming back, the same problems demand attention again and again, and your efforts bring less and less clarity? Involvement no longer leads to resolution. At this stage, the problem is no longer achievement or survival. It is constant energy loss. This book focuses on 5 Stoic lessons that address this shift directly. They are not about endurance, emotional suppression, or moral discipline. They are about making clearer decisions around attention, involvement, and responsibility. Each lesson is a simple practice you can apply the same day, right in the situation that is wearing you out right now. At this point, it is fair to ask, why Stoicism at all? Why return to a framework that is often described as ancient or philosophical? The answer is simple. Stoicism was not built to inspire or comfort. It was built to help people live inside conditions they could not control. Uncertainty, loss, pressure, responsibility. It works not because it is old, but because it is aligned with how humans actually deal with limits. There is also a biological explanation for why this alignment becomes so clear later in life. With age, the brain grows less tolerant of stress that produces no meaningful outcome. It reacts more strongly to unresolved conflict and repeated pressure. But this shift is not weakness. It is a form of refinement. The mind becomes better at distinguishing between effort that matters and effort that is wasted. Strategies based on carrying everything eventually break down, not through failure, but through a refusal to burn energy without return. This is why Stoicism stops sounding theoretical and starts sounding practical. It aligns with how a mature mind prefers to function, with selectivity, clarity, and deliberate use of attention. Hold that thought, because you are about to meet the first principle. It is simple, but not easy. Learning to stop trying to control what cannot be controlled, and finally taking responsibility for what has always been within your reach. Chapter 1. What you can control and what you can't. The first principle of Stoicism is called the dichotomy of control. It simply means this: some things are yours to influence, and some things are not. Your job is to stop wasting energy on what isn't yours and start using what you have on what is. Everything that's exhausting you right now comes from getting this backwards. You know that moment at the end of a conversation when you've explained yourself for the 100th time and nothing has shifted? Whether it's your partner, your adult child, or your boss, the result is always the same. Hollowed out, realizing that all that effort, all those carefully chosen words, all that energy poured into trying to move something, it went nowhere. That feeling isn't a sign you didn't try hard enough. It's a sign you've been trying to control something that was never actually yours to control in the first place. This happens more at midlife than it used to. When you were younger, time felt infinite, so spending months or years trying to change someone's mind seemed reasonable. Abundance made extravagance possible. The cost seemed small against endless years ahead. But around 40 or 45, something fundamental shifts. Time stops being free. It becomes expensive. And suddenly, the same effort that used to feel like persistence now feels like drowning. Your body knows it. Your nervous system knows it before your mind does. Exhaustion settles into you in a way that sleep doesn't touch. And a quiet voice starts asking whether something about how you're living has become unsustainable. The real problem isn't that you lack assertiveness or good boundaries. The real problem is far simpler and far harder. You've spent decades trying to control things that were never actually yours to control. Think of Kendall Roy from the HBO show Succession. He spends the entire series trying to control one thing: his father Logan's perception of him. Does he want his father's approval? Absolutely. Is it possible to make that happen through effort, strategy, or performance? Never. Every manipulation, every power play, every moment of vulnerability, all of it directed at moving something immovable. The show is excruciating to watch precisely because we see his exhaustion. We watch him pour everything into a task that the structure of the world has already decided is impossible. And that's the exhaustion you're feeling now. You're working with the wrong tools on the wrong problem. Look at where this shows up in your actual life. There's the weight of trying to guide your adult children. Explanations don't shift this. Pointing out patterns doesn't help. Hours spent trying to make them see things differently yield nothing but weariness. Deep down, you know the truth. You can't think for someone else. You can't make them want to change. You can't force understanding. Yet, your heart keeps trying anyway. Year after year of this creates a specific weight, the kind that doesn't explode suddenly, but instead builds like sediment, layer upon layer, until the relationship itself feels heavy. Then there's the marriage. Your partner responds to things in ways that create friction. Efforts at connection sometimes backfire. Hoping that good communication will finally break through the wall leaves you drained. But reality cuts deeper. Whether your boss notices depends on their biases, their mood, their attention, their politics, none of which you can touch. Adjusting yourself, performing, hoping the right combination of effort and visibility will finally move the needle. It doesn't. It almost never does. What ties all of these together is that you're burning mental fuel on tasks that don't produce results. Swimming upstream and blaming yourself for not being a strong enough swimmer misses the point entirely. The problem isn't your strength. The problem is fighting the current itself. Seneca, the ancient Stoic philosopher, understood something crucial. He lived during plague, during political uncertainty, during the constant pressure of power and the threat of losing everything. In his letters, he wrote about how exhaustion doesn't come from circumstance. It comes from fighting what you can't change. He described the peace that arrives when you finally stop trying to move the immovable and instead direct your entire being toward what's actually yours. That shift, he suggested, was where freedom lived. Epictetus understood this more deeply than most. Enslaved, his body wasn't even his own. He had no legal control over his life, his time, his freedom, his future. Ownership belonged to someone else. Yet he discovered something that freed him completely. The things actually within his control were far more powerful than anything he could have controlled through force or effort. His insight ran deep. The body doesn't belong to you, but attention does. Other people's reactions aren't yours to command, but the decision to care about what matters absolutely is. Controlling whether others understand you is impossible, but choosing honesty anyway is within reach. This is your domain. Not the domain of moving others, but of moving yourself. Across generations and circumstances, people tend toward the same mistake. Vast energy goes into making others think differently, into guaranteeing outcomes, into managing how people perceive from the outside. Meanwhile, the one area where complete power exists, how one shows up, what one decides to care about, how one responds when things fall apart, gets abandoned, left untended. And then confusion arrives. Why nothing seems to work. Your brain is finally getting smart about this. Around midlife, something shifts neurologically. Selectivity increases regarding where energy gets spent. Refusal to burn fuel on tasks that produce nothing grows stronger. This isn't weakness, not the softening that comes with age. Rather, your nervous system is finally doing its job correctly. It tells you what matters. Stop here. This isn't working. A better way exists. So let's be specific about what's actually in your control and what isn't. In your control, whether the conversation happens, what gets said when it does, how present you remain, whether listening occurs or only waiting for your turn to speak, how the person in front of you gets treated, whether honesty dominates or protection takes over, effort, integrity, choices about what comes next. These belong to you, not in your control, whether they listen, whether they change their mind, whether agreement arrives, how they feel about what you said, what gets done with it, whether your effort gets appreciated, their choices, their feelings, outcomes, results. These do not belong to you. This distinction transforms everything. Once clarity arrives, energy stops flooding toward the impossible. Convincing someone to love you ceases. Instead, you become someone worth loving. Making your boss see your value ends. Instead, work gets created that speaks for itself. Controlling your child's path stops. Instead, an honest life gets shown to them, and stepping back becomes possible. Hearing this feels obvious. Living it takes different work. The pull to control everything, especially the people closest to you, is ancient, wired into your nervous system. When someone matters to you, your brain's default setting is protection, guidance, fixing the broken parts. That's not bad. That's love. But love without wisdom about what can and can't be influenced becomes resentment, slow erosion of the very relationships you wanted to protect. A wall built brick by brick from good intentions. Here's what actually shifts when this principle comes alive in how you live. Energy returns, not overnight, not like a switch flips, but gradually, as fuel stops pouring into impossible work, capacity becomes available for things that matter. Room for thinking about your own life, your own choices, your own growth opens up. Space to breathe inside your own existence replaces the consumption of trying to manage everyone else's. Something unexpected unfolds too. When trying to change the people around you stops, many of them relax. Pressure lifts, safety arrives. Space opens where genuine transformation becomes possible, not because force got applied, but because blocking got removed. Connection far deeper than years of trying to fix them ever created becomes real. Making this real requires action today. Not next week when you're ready, not tomorrow when things settle. Today, find one situation where trying to control something that isn't working has become familiar. A relationship, something at work, something involving your adult child. Choose something specific. Take that situation and strip away everything from it that isn't actually yours to influence. What remains? That's your real domain. That's where power lives. In that situation, where has most energy been flowing? Almost certainly toward the parts where control doesn't exist. Exhaustion shows. Resentment surfaces. Nothing changes. Of course, nothing changes. Fighting happens with the wrong tools. Ask yourself this one question. What if that energy moved? What if convincing them stopped and becoming someone worth listening to became the focus? What if fighting for a specific outcome ended and controlling effort, presence, honesty became the work? What would that look like? This shift, from trying to control what can't be controlled to mastering what genuinely can, is where power lives. And it's available right now, not someday, right now. The next time that situation shows up and exhaustion arrives with it, pause. Ask, is this actually mine to control? If no, move your energy. Move it to something that is. Try it once. See what happens. Discover what opens when fighting a battle you were never meant to win finally stops. This is the foundation. Everything else in this book rests on this principle. Because knowing where actual power is located finally allows harder questions to be asked. What about your own past? Which choices have kept you fighting? What parts of your history does self-punishment still target, as if somehow going back and rewriting was possible? What keeps getting held against yourself? That's the real work. That's what comes next. For now, let this settle. Your power is enormous. Start spending it on yourself. Chapter 2. Accepting your past without fighting yourself. The second principle of Stoicism is amor fati, the love of fate. It is the practice of radical acceptance toward everything that has already happened. While you cannot rewrite a single line of your history, you can change how you relate to it right now. Most people spend their lives at war with their own past, condemning a younger version of themselves for not knowing then what they only learned through the pain of the mistake itself. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that arrives in midlife, different from the exhaustion of trying to control others. You lie awake replaying decisions from 20 years ago. Someone else succeeds in the career you abandoned, and something tightens in your chest. Your child makes a choice, and you think, if I had known then what I know now, everything would be different. This exhaustion is regret mixed with the helplessness of knowing that no amount of wishing changes what already happened. The trap is believing that punishment works backward. If you condemn yourself enough, if you replay the failure enough times, somehow the past becomes different. It doesn't. Self-condemnation doesn't rewrite history. It steals today's. You're using precious present moments, hating yourself for a yesterday you cannot touch. When you made a choice that turned out badly, your mind wants to understand why. It extracts the lesson so it doesn't happen again. That's useful. That's learning. But then something shifts. The learning stops. The rumination continues. You move from, I made a mistake and here's what I'll do differently, to, I am fundamentally flawed for making that mistake. The first is wisdom. The second is torture. Andy Dufresne from the Shawshank Redemption carries guilt about one defining event. He spends decades in prison. He could have spent those decades hating himself, using the past as evidence of his worthlessness. Instead, he refuses to let it consume him. He keeps hope alive. He keeps moving and being useful. He doesn't erase what happened. He simply refuses to let it define every moment moving forward. That's what acceptance actually means. It's not pretending things were fine. Acceptance means acknowledging that something occurred, understanding what it taught you, and then choosing to stop using it as evidence against yourself. Viktor Frankl, a psychologist who survived Nazi concentration camps, discovered something that matters profoundly here. He said that even in the worst circumstances, when everything external is stripped away, one thing cannot be taken: your ability to choose your response to what happens. He watched people in camps break in two different ways. Some broke because they lost hope. Others broke because they clung to a past version of life that couldn't be recovered. The ones who survived, not just physically, but spiritually, accepted that the life they had planned was gone, and then found meaning in what remained. You're not in a concentration camp. Your circumstances are immeasurably better. And yet, you're doing something similar. You're clinging to what your life should have been, the career you didn't pursue, the person you didn't marry, the years you wasted. In clinging to it, refusing to accept that it's gone, you make your present unbearable. The second principle is about a specific kind of acceptance, not accepting mistreatment or injustice as permanent, but accepting that what happened, happened, and that the person you were when it happened was doing the best they could with what they knew. Think about the gap between who you are now and who you were when you made the choice you regret most. At that moment, with that level of maturity, with those specific fears and limitations and information, what were your actual options? Not the options you see now from the vantage point of additional experience. The actual options available to you then. You chose a relationship that didn't work out. You were younger. You didn't know what you didn't know. You couldn't have predicted how it would unfold. The choice made sense at the time. It led to pain, sure. But pain is not the same as a mistake. Sometimes the most important growth comes from the choices that hurt us most. You stayed in a career too long, watching others surge ahead. But you were afraid. Fear isn't stupidity. Fear is what keeps mammals alive. You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how. Maybe that was the right choice at that moment, even if it doesn't look that way now. You weren't there for your kids the way you wish you had been. You were working. You were stressed. You were caught in survival mode. Could you have done differently? Possibly. But you were also doing everything you could to keep the family together. That wasn't negligence. That was survival. Around midlife, your brain naturally shifts toward what researchers call narrative integration. It stops being consumed with moment-to-moment survival and starts wanting to make sense of your life as a whole. It wants to weave the broken pieces together into one story. This is a gift. But there's danger. If that story is one of shame and failure, if you've been doing it all wrong, that narrative becomes toxic. Your brain will reinforce it. Remember evidence that supports it. Overlook evidence that doesn't. The key is choosing a different story. Not a lie and not a fantasy where everything went perfectly, but a narrative that holds the pain without letting it swallow you. It's a story that says, I made choices and I paid the price. Some of it hurt. But I learned. I am here, I am growing, and I can finally point my life toward what actually matters. This requires a specific practice. Write to yourself at the age when you made the choice you regret most. In that letter, recall what you didn't know then. What were you afraid of? What information was missing? What pressures were you under? What did you believe about yourself that wasn't true? Write with compassion, not judgment. You're not excusing the choice. You're understanding it. Read the letter back. Notice whether the shame feels the same. Notice whether you can access, even slightly, compassion for the younger version of yourself who was doing their best. Then ask yourself, is there anything I'm still punishing myself for? Any choice from a decade ago that I bring up regularly, using it as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy? That's the one to focus on, because that one is still stealing your present. The difference between healthy regret and toxic regret is simple. Healthy regret leads to a specific action. You learned something, you changed your behavior, you moved on. Toxic regret is a loop. You think about the same failure over and over. You feel bad. You think about it again. No action changes, just rumination, just the slow corrosion of your own sense of worth. Breaking the loop requires conscious choice. When the old story comes up, the one about how you wasted years, how you failed, you pause. You acknowledge it. Then you ask, what would happen if I let this go? Not pretend it didn't happen, but stopped using it as evidence against myself? What would open up? What energy would be freed? What could you do with the mental space that's currently occupied by regret? What actually happens when people accept their past? They stop leaking energy. The amount of mental fuel that goes into defending yourself against your own judgment is enormous. It's like running your car with the parking brake on. You're using fuel but going nowhere. Release that brake, and suddenly you have capacity for relationships, for growth, for building something new instead of endlessly reconstructing what's broken. This principle connects directly with the first one. You cannot control the past. That's fixed. But you can control how you think about it. You can decide whether it's evidence of your inadequacy or evidence of your humanity. You can choose whether regret becomes a teacher or a torturer. Seneca wrote that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. He was talking about the imagination that insists the past should have been different. The suffering doesn't come from what happened. It comes from the internal war against what happened. So today, identify one regret that still has weight. One choice you still use against yourself. Write down what you didn't know then. Write down what you were afraid of. Write down what you believed about yourself that proved untrue. Then write, I did the best I could with what I had. Say it out loud. Hear how it sounds. Notice whether something shifts, even slightly. Because acceptance isn't weakness. Acceptance isn't giving up. Acceptance is freeing yourself from the one prison that actually has a key you can turn. The lock is on the inside. Chapter 3. Emotional Boundaries and Inner Stability in Stoic Philosophy. The third principle of Stoicism is the inner citadel. It isn't about guarding your house, your bank account, or even your schedule. It's about protecting your internal sovereignty. This is the one space where no one else's chaos can reach you unless you open the gates yourself. Your emotional stability. Your right to say no without shame. Boundaries aren't walls you build to keep people out. They're lines you draw that say, this is what I will accept, and this is what I won't. Respect that, or we cannot be close. Something shifts at midlife that was invisible before. The people who've been taking from your emotional reserves without giving back haven't become more respectful. They've become more skilled at making you feel guilty for having boundaries. A relative calls and immediately dumps their crisis without asking how you are. A partner withdraws affection when you express a need instead of absorbing theirs. An adult child expects you to fix what they won't address themselves. A boss treats your time off as a suggestion rather than a fact. For decades, you've absorbed this. You told yourself it was love, loyalty, being a good person. You became a sponge for other people's emotions. If someone was upset, you felt responsible for fixing it. If someone was disappointed, you felt you'd failed. If someone needed something, your mouth said yes while your entire body screamed no. The cost compounds. Every yes that means no is a small betrayal of yourself. Every time you absorb someone else's feeling and make it yours, you give them access to your nervous system. Every time you prioritize their comfort over your integrity, you teach them that your boundaries don't matter. You teach yourself the same thing. Watch what happens in the film First Reformed. The main character is so committed to serving others that he slowly erases. He absorbs everyone's despair until there's nothing left of him. By the time he realizes what's happened, the damage is done. The film devastates precisely because we recognize that slow disappearance. The way a person vanishes when their boundaries dissolve completely. Maya Angelou said something that cuts through all the guilt. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. This isn't cruelty. It's clarity. When someone treats you poorly, they're giving you information about who they are and what they're willing to do. The question isn't whether they love you. The question is, do I accept being treated this way? And if the answer is no, what am I going to do about it? Boundaries aren't punishment. They're information. They tell the other person what you need to feel safe and respected. Sometimes people accept that information and change. Often they don't. When they don't, the boundary simply becomes a consequence. You said, "If you treat me this way, I will need to distance myself." They chose to keep treating you that way. Now you're following through. The guilt attached to boundaries is manufactured. It's been installed by people who benefit from your compliance. Your parents may have taught you that your needs were secondary, that taking care of others was your job, that asking for anything for yourself was selfish. Those lessons were designed to keep you manageable. At midlife, it's time to uninstall them. Look at the specific relationships where you feel drained. Not all of them, just the ones where something tightens in your chest when you see their name. What happens in those relationships? The person triggers something in you, and you collapse into compliance. You override yourself. You become what they need instead of who you are. Around midlife, your nervous system becomes more sensitive to relational threat. The brain systems connected to bonding become more attuned to danger and safety. You notice, more sharply than before, when someone is manipulating you, using emotional pressure to extract compliance, pretending cruelty is honesty. This heightened sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's intelligence. Your body is telling you, pay attention to this person. They are unsafe. For decades, you may have overridden that signal. You told yourself you were too sensitive, too reactive. That real love means tolerating mistreatment. Your body is finally insisting, that's not true. And your body is right. Boundaries have a structure. The first part is clarity. You need to know exactly what your boundary is. Not vaguely, but specifically. It's not, I need more respect. It's, I will not accept being spoken to that way, and when it happens, I will end the conversation. Vagueness is your nervous system trying to negotiate. Specificity is your nervous system being firm. The second part is consistency. A boundary that bends is not a boundary. It's an invitation to keep pushing. If you enforce it sometimes, but not others, the other person learns that persistence wears you down. They'll keep testing until you cave. Consistency means every time, no exceptions. The third part is accepting what happens next. When you set a boundary, the other person will likely react poorly. They may get angry. They may withdraw. They may tell you you're selfish. That's their choice. Your job is to hold the boundary. Their job is to decide whether they can accept it. You don't manage their reaction. You just stay firm. The actual words matter because they control the energy of the moment. When you're setting a boundary, you need language that's clear and short. Long explanations are your nervous system negotiating. Short statements are your nervous system being solid. I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. I'm not available for that conversation right now. No. When you state a boundary without an excuse, you will feel a sharp, cold Fear. That fear is normal. It's your nervous system telling you that setting this boundary will have consequences. It's right. People who've benefited from your lack of boundaries will not like you suddenly having them. You need to be prepared for that. Have the words ready before you need them, because the moment you need to set a boundary is usually the moment you're most dysregulated. The other person may be aggressive or hurt. You're vulnerable to collapsing back into your old pattern. Being nice, being compliant, being whatever they need you to be. I care about you, and I also need to protect my own well-being. I understand you're upset, and I'm still not able to do that. I love you, and I also need you to respect my boundaries. These aren't cruel. They're honest. Here's what changes when you actually set boundaries. The relationships worth keeping become more intimate. The people who genuinely love you, who respect you, who want you whole, they'll accept the boundary. They may not like it, but they'll accept it. The relationship deepens because it's now based on mutual respect instead of your self-abandonment. The relationships that were never healthy begin to dissolve. This is necessary. A relationship that requires you to be less than yourself, to suppress your needs, to absorb endless harm. That isn't love. It's a hostage situation. You're finally walking out, and that takes courage. Brené Brown, who studies vulnerability and shame, calls boundaries the foundation of wholehearted living. Without them, you're constantly negotiating with other people about who you are and what you need. With them, you're clear. You're solid. You're available to love because you're not exhausted from being consumed. This principle connects with the first two in a crucial way. You can't control whether people respect your boundaries. That's outside your domain. But you can control whether you set them. You can't change your past, but you can accept it and stop using it as a reason to be smaller. And you can control your inner space. You can decide it's worth protecting. So today, identify one relationship where you feel drained. Not all of them. One. Ask yourself, what boundary do I need here? What would make me feel safer? Be specific. I need more respect is too vague to be effective. I won't accept being yelled at or treated like my feelings don't matter. That's clear. Write it down. Write the exact words you'll use. Imagine saying them to the person. Now imagine what you'll do if they react badly. You'll survive it. You've survived worse. Set the boundary once. Don't over-explain. Don't apologize. Don't negotiate. Just state it clearly and see what happens. This is the real test, not whether they like you. The test is whether they can respect a person who no longer shrinks to make them comfortable. Chapter 4. Understanding Time and Life. Priorities through Stoicism. The fourth principle of Stoicism is called memento mori, the awareness of your own mortality. You will die. Probably decades from now, but the counter is ticking, and your number of breaths is limited. This is clarity, and once you genuinely accept it, everything else becomes obvious. At midlife, something shifts in how you perceive time. For the first time, the future has actual edges. You do the math. 30 years left, perhaps only 15. This isn't an abstract number. It's your real boundary, the calendar that actually matters. That's a finite amount of time, which means every single choice about how you spend a day is now a choice about what your life actually is. Most people avoid this thought. It's uncomfortable, scary, so they reach for distraction instead. Endless scrolling, empty obligations, relationships that became ballast years ago. Meanwhile, somewhere beneath the noise, they know the truth. Time is passing, and they're living someone else's life. The Stoics had a practice centered on this principle. Regularly contemplate your own mortality. Memento mori sounds morbid. It strips away the trivial instead. When you genuinely accept that you will die, things stop mattering. The argument about nothing stops mattering. The resentment you've nursed for 3 years stops mattering. The obligation to attend an event you hate stops mattering. The need to prove yourself to people who will never respect you anyway evaporates completely. All of it becomes obviously optional. Think about the characters in About Time. A father and son have a strained relationship. They argue about trivial things. They distance themselves over nothing. Then the father dies suddenly, and the son realizes, I spent my finite time being angry. I doused my remaining days in resentment instead of just being present. That film isn't about magical time travel. It's about the regret that arrives when you finally understand what mattered. But only when it's far too late. The mechanism at midlife is neurological. Your brain naturally shifts from perceiving time as unlimited to perceiving it as scarce. This shift is optimization, clarity arriving naturally. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that plans and prioritizes, starts making different calculations. It begins to ask, given that time is limited, what actually deserves my attention? This mental shift is a gift disguised as a crisis. Instead of embracing the clarity, we resist it, mislabeling our new awareness as anxiety. We try to drown out the signal with sheer volume, more work, more possessions, more hollow obligations. We create chaos to avoid the truth that the discomfort is trying to reveal. Your life is being spent on things that don't deserve your attention. Look at what actually consumes your hours right now. Wake up, work, handle obligations, scroll, sleep. Repeat. 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. That's 2,000 hours per year spent in a way that doesn't bring you alive. Extend that across 30 years. 60,000 hours. That's years of your life, sold for pennies, in a half-conscious state, on things that will mean nothing the day you die. The conflicts that steal emotional energy. Resentment toward a family member, the need to win an argument with your partner, frustration with a coworker who doesn't respect you. These evaporate when you apply the mortality lens. Will this matter when I'm 80? The answer is almost always, absolutely not. Seneca didn't just mention this principle. He obsessed over it. He insisted that life isn't short, but that we make it so by hemorrhaging our time. We squander our hours on people who don't deserve our presence and bury ourselves under obligations we never bothered to question. Too often, we surrender to the anesthetic of routine because we're afraid of the sharp aliveness of a real choice. 2,000 years later, his warning feels less like ancient history and more like a modern diagnosis. The practice of memento mori doesn't mean dwelling on death. It means pausing regularly and asking, if I died this year, would I be satisfied with how I spent the last 12 months? If you're honest, most people say no. Years spent on things that didn't matter. Years spent appeasing people who didn't appreciate it. Years spent in jobs that paid well but left them hollow. Years spent maintaining relationships out of obligation rather than love. The Stoics didn't suggest abandoning responsibility. They suggested questioning which responsibilities were actually yours. A lot of what you think you must do, you actually chose to do. A lot of what feels obligatory, you accepted as obligatory without ever questioning it. Your boss's unrealistic deadline, his burden, not yours. Your mother-in-law's opinions about how you're raising your kids, noise you can turn off. Your adult child's choices, entirely theirs to make. Your friend's expectations of your time, not binding. Each of these obligations is optional the moment you decide it is. The space that opens up when you question these is enormous. It's the space where your actual life finally happens. Marcus Aurelius possessed enormous power. The emperor could have spent his time on accumulation, conquest, pleasure. Instead, Aurelius wrote a book about the philosophy of letting go. He wrote about how none of the things people chase actually matter. How the only thing that matters is virtue, meaning, integrity, being the person you know you should be. He had less time than most people to figure this out, and every moment of that limited time went toward the thing that actually mattered. So here's the practical application. Create 3 circles. First circle, the things you genuinely care about. Second circle, things that are important but peripheral. Third circle, everything else, obligations you accepted without questioning, things you do out of guilt or habit or fear. Now ask yourself, if I had 5 years to live, would I still do the third circle? The answer is no, always no. So why are you doing them now? The answer is usually because it's easier to say yes than to say no. Because you're afraid of disappointing someone. Because you're used to it and change feels hard. But you're already paying the price. Every single day. You're paying in the currency of your actual life. You're paying with hours and days and years that you'll never get back. The next step requires ruthlessness. Look at your calendar for the next month. Count up the hours you spend on Circle 3 obligations. Imagine those hours simply vanishing. What becomes possible? Where could your attention finally go? It is a shocking realization. You can drop the majority of your obligations without the sky falling. The world is more resilient than your anxiety suggests. Your boss finds a workaround, your relatives look elsewhere for support, and people either adjust to your boundaries or leave. Life moves on. The reality is that your indispensability was a prison you built for yourself, and the door has been unlocked the whole time. What would change is that your life would finally be yours. That requires choosing it actively, saying yes to things you want, prioritizing your integrity over other people's comfort, spending your days on things that matter to you. The mortality lens makes this choice unavoidable. You're running out of time. You can't do everything. So you have to choose. And choosing through passivity, continuing to say yes to everything, is still a choice. It's just a choice you're making without acknowledging it. Seneca also wrote that 1,000 people die every day who thought they'd live forever. Premonition arrives only at the end, when it's far too late. They spend their final days looking back at a life spent waiting to start living, trapped in obligations they resented the whole time. That outcome is available to you. So is the other one. You already know. You already feel the clock. You already sense the finite nature of your time. The question is simply, what will you do with this knowledge? The answer arrives in a simple practice. Today, identify one obligation that you actually don't want. One thing you do out of guilt or habit or fear. One Circle 3 item that eats your time but doesn't feed your soul. Then say no to it. Simply say no. Watch what happens. The person will be disappointed or angry or confused. Your nervous system will activate. You'll feel guilt. Then, 3 days later, you'll realize that nothing terrible happened. The world kept turning. The person found another way. And you have hours back in your life. That's the beginning. That's what shifts when you really accept your mortality. Liberation. The liberation of finally using your finite time in service of things that actually matter to you. Chapter 5. Choosing growth over comfort. The final principle. The fifth principle of Stoicism is called the ultimate agency. It is your fundamental choice. Everything in this book rests on this one truth. You possess a power that is absolute and untouchable. It's the ability to choose your own character. While you can't control the weather or the past, you have total authority over how you decide to meet the present moment. The fifth principle of Stoicism means your fundamental power to choose. You have the ability to decide who you become, how you respond to what happens, and what you do with your remaining time. This is your absolute power. It exists in the space between what happens to you and how you decide to interpret it. This is the only rung that matters when everything else collapses. At midlife, you stand at a crossroads that most people never recognize. On one path lies comfort. It's the path you've been walking, the same alarm clock, the same drive to work, the same predictable disappointments. Your brain chooses familiar misery over terrifying unknowns. There's pain on this path, resentment, exhaustion, the slow disappearance of yourself. But it's pain you've adapted to. Your nervous system prefers what it knows. The other path leads to growth, the place where everything truly shifts. Choosing this direction requires a willingness to sit in the cold light of discomfort and draw boundaries that will, inevitably, anger those used to your compliance. It's about walking away from situations that no longer serve your soul and evolving into someone your younger self wouldn't even recognize. On this path, you finally trade shame for wisdom, treating your finite hours as a currency too precious to waste on things that simply don't matter. The trap is believing you can have both, that somehow you can stay in your current life and magically become different. That's how the human brain works. It wants to keep everything and also change everything. It wants to avoid the discomfort of growth while arriving at a transformed destination. It simply doesn't work that way. Growth isn't an addition. It's a trade. To establish boundaries, you first have to shed the version of yourself that lives to say yes. Finding a deep, genuine presence in meaningful relationships often requires letting go of the ones that only drain your spirit. In the same way, work that brings you alive usually demands walking away from the hollow security of a paycheck that leaves you empty. To move forward, you must finally abandon the narrative that you are merely a victim of your own history. Look at the character of Walter Mitty from the film of the same name. Instead of living, Mitty spent decades collecting dreams inside his head. Imagination became his prison. He was safe, but completely inert. Then something shifted. Fear finally surrendered to action. He quit. He traveled. He faced what terrified him. And in that terror, he became someone he recognized. That film is essentially about the moment someone realizes that comfort is a slow death, and that growth, though terrifying, is the only thing that actually feels like living. People often wonder how to tell the difference between a call to change and the static of simple anxiety. The answer lies in the direction of the feeling. Real growth tastes like a homecoming, a sense that you are finally becoming more of who you were meant to be. Anxiety, by contrast, feels like a frantic escape from yourself. While avoidance leaves you cramped and diminished, the act of choosing growth feels like a vast, inevitable expansion. Modern neurobiology confirms what the Stoics felt. Your brain is primed for this shift. Plasticity, the ability to rewire and reorganize, isn't a young person's game. It's an active, evolving force within you. At midlife, your mind isn't a fading relic, but a highly optimized system. You possess an asset no 20-year-old can claim: deep context. Fueled by experience, you can now detect patterns that were once invisible and bridge connections that younger brains simply can't see. This isn't a decline. It is your biological edge. But plasticity requires discomfort. It requires pushing against your current patterns. It requires doing things that feel wrong because they're new. It requires tolerating the anxiety that comes when you step outside the groove your brain has worn into itself over decades. Your brain will resist this. It will tell you to retreat. It will remind you of all the reasons why the comfortable path is safer. That resistance is normal. It's not a sign that you're making a mistake. It's the sign that you're actually growing. The Stoics understood something that modern psychology is only now catching up to. Discomfort is information. When you feel resistance to growth, that resistance isn't telling you to stop. It's telling you that your nervous system is expanding. It's telling you that you're pushing against the edges of who you currently are. And your current identity wants to stay small because small is familiar. Marcus Aurelius had enormous power. The emperor could have spent his time on accumulation, conquest, pleasure. Aurelius understood the cost of choosing growth. He understood that honest living requires sacrifice. He understood that virtue, meaning integrity, becoming who you know you should be, would demand everything from him. And he chose it anyway. His life became his legacy precisely because he chose discomfort over comfort. Scan the landscape of your life and pinpoint exactly where the gears have seized. It shows up in the relationship where you've traded genuine presence for a ghost-like passivity, and in the career that has become a site of quiet resignation. You can see it in the hollow friendships where your true self no longer appears, and in those automatic habits that slowly bleed your energy dry. Most dangerously, it is found in that static, unmoving version of yourself that you finally, mistakenly, accepted as permanent. All of those areas have one thing in common. They feel safe because they're familiar. Your nervous system has adapted to them. Your identity has wrapped itself around them. To change any of those things would mean disrupting everything. Your brain is telling you that the cost is too high. Here's the truth your brain is trying to hide. You're already paying the cost. Every single day, you're paying in energy, in health, in the slow corrosion of your sense of self-worth, in years of your finite life, in the increasingly desperate feeling that you're running out of time. The tax on growth is real, but it's a one-time payment. It arrives as a season of friction, a period of intense internal resistance and haunting self-doubt that makes the familiar past look tempting. But these are merely symptoms of a system in transition. Once the fog of this temporary discomfort clears, you are left with a version of yourself that is finally unshakable, more integrated, more present, and undeniably more alive. This is the point where all 5 principles converge into a single, unshakable way of being. It's the shift from begging for external respect to the quiet authority of setting your own boundaries. It's the transition from relitigating a dead past to distilling it into wisdom for the future. You stop trying to outmaneuver fate and instead take total ownership of your choices in the present. Because time is a dwindling resource, you finally dedicate your remaining hours to the essential. And because you refuse to fade away in the anesthetic of comfort, you choose the heat of growth by design. The 5th principle is about choosing. It's about recognizing that despite everything, despite your past, despite your circumstances, despite your fears, you still have the power to decide who you become in this moment, and the next moment, and the one after that. This agency is your most sacred possession, outstripping the hollow promises of money, security, or comfort. It is the only thing truly immune to theft, an indestructible constant that survives any external storm. Ultimately, it is this power alone that grants life its weight, its meaning, and its worth. So today, identify one area where you're choosing comfort over growth. One situation where you're smaller than you want to be. One thing you've been waiting to do until the conditions were perfect. Stop asking what the person you are today would do. Instead, ask, what would the version of me I am becoming do right now? Then, take that step. Move while the nerves are still raw. Act even as your brain screams that it's a mistake, and commit before you've solved the puzzle of how it all ends. Here is the hidden truth. You will never feel ready. In fact, that sense of preparedness is the enemy of evolution. A settled nervous system is a stagnant one. If you feel comfortable and certain, you aren't growing. Waiting for perfect conditions is simply a sophisticated way of ensuring you never truly begin. Growth feels premature. It feels like you're doing it too soon, before you've figured it all out. That feeling is correct. You're supposed to feel that way. That means your nervous system is expanding. That means you're choosing the unknown over the comfortable. Set the boundary today. Make the call, have the conversation, take the leap. The discomfort is temporary. Regret is permanent. Choose wisely. Because here's what most people don't understand about the end of life. Regret isn't about the things you did. Regret is about the things you didn't do. About the versions of yourself you never became. About the comfort you chose instead of growth. This is where all 5 principles find their center, not in some distant future, but right here, in this very breath. You may never govern the outcome, but you hold absolute authority over the choice. You cannot rewrite a single line of your history, yet you honor it the moment you refuse to be defined by it. While the future remains beyond your command, you can so thoroughly fortify your inner space that whatever arrives, it finds you whole. Time will never be infinite, but it no longer has to be wasted. You are standing at the edge of the only decision that matters, the friction of becoming, or the slow anesthesia of staying the same. The path is clear. The question is, will you take the first step?